Before we get started, we just want to thank Old Republic Surety for sponsoring this episode of Let's Get Surety, as well as NASBP virtual seminars for the 5th year in a row. For more information on Old Republic Surety, visit www.orsurety.com. Now on to our show.
You're listening to Let's Get Surety. Let me hear your bonding talk with Kat Shamapande.
Hey everyone, it's Kat Shamapande. Welcome to this episode of Let's Get Surety. I've got with me today Mark McCallum, my co-host and CEO of NASBP. Hey Mark, thanks for being on.
Absolutely. Hi Kat. This is a very timely topic.
It's very energetic.
Yep.
We're going to be talking about alternative energy bonding. To do that, we've got with us Nathan Wonder. He's Vice President of Surety Natural Resources with CAC Specialty. Hey, thanks for being on, Nathan.
Hey, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
We are thrilled to have you on. And, I'll be up front just to get us started. Nathan has done several presentations for us on natural resources and bonding, which is amazing. We'll include links to all of those in the description for this podcast if you want to check any of those out. But he's going to be updating us on what's changed since then. But before we dive into that topic, Nathan, can you just tell us a little bit about you and about CAC Specialty?
Yeah, sure. So I live in Portland, Oregon. I've been at CAC Specialty for a couple of years now. And, we're a full-service brokerage, but we do have some very specific specializations in some high-volume surety areas. So I work primarily in power and renewables. So I see a lot of renewable and alternative energy bonding. We have a specialist who does oil and gas, minerals and mining, and then we really can cover the full suite of really all surety obligations. But I'd say like 75% of my day is really on renewable energy, not just here in the United States, but all around the world. A lot of solar and wind and battery storage, and some emerging technologies as well that are needing bonds for the very first time, which is always a challenge.
Well, when you got into bonding, did you decide you wanted to specialize in alternative energy or in more interesting types of commercial bonding? Or
No, I think my bonding career on the agency side probably started pretty similar to most people, where my first month was issuing like 1,000 notary bonds, so I could just kind of learn what it is. And, so I paid my dues. And then I really started out more of a traditional contract, local, regional contractors, getting some of that basic surety 101 under my belt. And then I started to run into some more renewable energy opportunities. We had a couple of really large accounts on the solar side of things. I got really interested in it, really dug into all those different contracts, found areas where they weren't using bonds, where maybe bonds could be used.
Yeah.
And from there, it just kind of spiraled. I kind of made the decision that I wanted that to be my niche. I've been able to see a lot of stuff since then, and I've been really lucky to work with a lot of great insurance producers in that space too. So I get to run into a lot of stuff.
Well, I know the whole world has changed a lot since the last time we had you on to talk about renewable energy. I think that was pre-pandemic. So. Yes. Can you tell us, what's changed in the renewable energy space and bonding?
Yeah, a lot of it has changed. And, from my perspective on the agency side, one of the most glaring things, especially for, solar and wind and battery storage here in the United States, is how you can win business on the surety side. 5-7 years ago, there weren't that many agencies that had done very many of these bonds. There weren't a lot of companies that needed them or knew that there was a possibility. So you could just walk in and say, hey, we can use bonds in lieu of letters of credit. Right. And they're like, wait, what's a bond? What do you, yeah. How is that different? And
a lot of education.
A lot of education, right? A lot of very high-level education. And then finding contracts where bonds weren't being used. Bonds were not always being used in PPAs, power purchase agreements. They weren't always being used in interconnection agreements. And some of those are still challenging, but there's a lot more opportunity now than there was 5 and 7 years ago. But now, if you go to the big solar conferences or the big wind conferences and you say, hey, you can use bonds instead of letters of credit, they're like, yeah, I know. We've been doing that for 5 years. What can you do differently?
Yeah.
And so it's not just having the capability of bonding or doing that like Surety 101 for them. It really is like, how can you slice a better cheddar as an agent? What capabilities do you have? What markets do you have access to? What's your portfolio like? It's a much different conversation than it was.
Yeah.
So what has been the driving force to make sure that they need security? Is that contractual or statutory, regulatory, or all of the above? So what has been the catalyst in that regard?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both, for sure. On the decommissioning side of things, those tend to be statutory.
Okay.
And sometimes they'll be driven by the individual landowner as well, but most of the time, those are rules that are coming from the town or the county or even the state at this point. On the interconnection agreements and the power purchase agreements, those are contractual obligations. And for a long time, people weren't reading that bond was an option. And now people are looking to see if bonding is an option. A lot of these renewable energy companies, they want to use bonds whenever they can. And a lot of them came from, some of those groups that me and people like me worked with 5 and 7 years ago. A lot of these people move companies a lot.
Right.
People who were, these like development managers or whoever at some of these big firms, they all left. They started a new one. They got that one. They sold it. They started a new one. And so there's these huge branches of trees where everybody kind of remembers, these 2 or 3 big companies that everybody has a connection to from one degree or another. So that the secret of bonding is kind of out. But it's how can you get some of these more difficult bonds done, and how can you tell the story of these companies? The companies are different.
Yeah.
They used to be bigger. They were capitalized. They had experience. They had assets. Now I'm working with companies that are asking for $100 million bond programs, and they don't have any assets. They're all development assets. They don't have any cash. Maybe there's private equity money behind them, right? That's pretty common. But understanding how that PE relationship works, these are the struggles of today. Because most of the big firms have very established, robust bond programs. But if you're trying to break in, you're going to be dealing with folks who don't have money and want all the bonds in the world.
So are there now the markets, the appetites to help you figure out and work through to achieve solutions for those demands?
Yeah, and that's a good point too. It's not just that the companies or the clients are more knowledgeable and that the agents are more knowledgeable, but the sureties are more knowledgeable too. And a lot of those people who worked on some of those big programs a few years ago have moved on to other places or started entirely new places. Right. And so they have that expertise built in. And for the first time, really, we're starting to see more and more sureties attending these industry events, the big solar conference, the big wind conference, even the smaller regional ones. We're seeing more and more underwriters come and not just hold meetings, but actually attend the seminars and actually learn more about the industry, it is super helpful because a lot of this stuff, you have to kind of dig into and read all those underlying, tariff agreements and everything. It's very complicated stuff. So it does take a little bit of commitment from the sureties and the underwriters to really want. You're not writing this stuff on accident.
Right.
You kind of have to want it.
So I'm just curious, and maybe, at least for me, it'd be very helpful maybe to kind of map out, both on solar and wind, what I call the security points or the bond points. You have different bonds for different things along the continuum for those energy production sources. Mm-hmm. Would you mind kind of just telling us a little bit where those bonds fall in place during that process?
Yeah, and these are essentially the same bonds that I talked about a few years ago when I wrote an article and did a webinar. The bonds that I'm writing the most are still the same bonds. Okay. So generally speaking, we can split it up between the groups that are developing these projects, the groups that are building them, and the groups that own them and operate them long term. So, and sometimes that's all one company, right? We have vertically integrated groups too, but more and more we're starting to see groups that are specialized, pure play developers who don't intend on owning or building. They're selling it when it's ready to build. Pure play contractors, all they do is build it, and then pure play IPPs, independent power producers, who actually own them and operate them long term. So on the development side, one of the most important things, and really like the hardest thing right now for a lot of these groups, is the interconnection.
Okay.
It's a very complicated process that we don't really have the time to get into, and I don't even fancy myself an expert. But you have to go through these like queue studies, because not every place in the country needs this kind of power,
right.
And not every place is next to a transmission point that can take on the load of an additional solar farm or something.
Right.
So you have to go through these queue studies, which are like 3-step processes, and those have letters of credit that are required. And so there is a potential bonding opportunity there, whether it's direct bonding or through a fronting partner on the banking side. So that's one of like the very first things, is like, can we even build this thing here? We have to partner with the utility or the the independent service operator, or whatever, system operator, to see if it makes sense to build this thing. Then they try to come up with a way to make money off this thing. So is it? Do they have an off-taker who's going to buy the power from the place? And that's kind of how they get financing in place. And this 5 and 7 years ago was one of the big hurdles. How do we get people to buy our power so that we can get our project financed? Now that's not difficult. It's very easy to find these groups. So these like power purchase agreements or offtake agreements, they're not as much of a like opportunity for me to step in and say I can, because it's like that's an easy piece for them. The interconnection is a more difficult piece. But then they get this offtake agreement set up. Then they're doing all the permitting at the same time.
Right.
So it's possible, depending on where you are, that you might need to get a decommissioning bond at this stage before you've even started construction. Depends on whether the town or the county might say you need it for your site use permit. So you haven't even done any building, and the town is already like, we want a guarantee of decommissioning.
Yeah.
So how do they, at that point, how do they predicate, what is the amount of the bond predicated on for decommissioning?
Yeah, it would be on most of the time, and decommissioning bonds, it's the Wild West. Like in solar and in wind, unless it's on government land where there are some pretty standardized rules, each little town, each little county, they're all going to calculate it their own way.
Okay.
And there may be some guidance from the state, or maybe they're looking at the town down the road and what did you guys do?
Yeah.
But the bond forms are not standardized at all. We're negotiating those with every different town attorney. The bond amounts are not standardized at all. I usually see there's some sort of third-party engineer decommissioning cost estimate is done.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
So they see like 30 years from now, how much do we think it's going to cost? Which nobody has any idea.
On something that's not built yet.
Exactly. And nobody has any idea what the cost of materials or anything is going to be. So it's all kind of silly. Some places build in every 5 years you have to reevaluate that amount, but different places are more sophisticated about it than others. So decommissioning bonds are just, and anything can happen. And sometimes you can get it done on a really easy annual renewable cancelable bond form, and sometimes they'll say we need it to have that non-cancellation clause and forfeiture language, and it can get really complicated depending on what each town wants.
So there's a lot of education that might need to be done in order for them to achieve that bond, correct?
Absolutely. A ton of education, and sometimes the client needs that education too, because they don't know why it might be difficult for them to get a 30-year obligation bond, even if it's not a very big penalty. We can't say that it starts today and expires 30 years from now. We have to come up with this like annual kind of language. Now there are a lot of places that have been requiring decommissioning bonds for a long time. And then there are some places that you don't need them at all. Some states, there's no decommissioning bond for wind or solar unless it's on government, like BLM land.
Interesting.
But some places that haven't required bonding are starting to now.
Okay.
So the state of South Carolina is going through a rulemaking process, and they're asking people in the industry to come up with what are these security requirements.
Right.
The state of Louisiana is doing the same thing, not just for onshore wind and solar, but for offshore as well. They're like, how do we put these rules together? And then, I want to be a part of this so I can try to come up with a unified bond form.
That would be great, right?
So that we don't have to keep negotiating a bond form with each individual town.
Exactly.
But and then like there are groups that aren't going to be grandfathered in. Like folks who are going to have to post a decommissioning bond on a site that's been operating for years, and they never had this additional cost as part of their projections for their cash flows and stuff. So there's a lot of push and pull in every direction, trying to accommodate people, but also trying to set up these rules for the very first time.
That's very interesting. You talked about the uniform bond form. So there's a real need for standardization, which would then help these communities and others really achieve the security they're seeking and would facilitate those transactions. So there's an opportunity for the industry, right?
I absolutely agree. I think having that standardization, even if it's not going to answer everyone's concerns every step of the way, like there's going to need to be some compromise, at least we would have predictability. Right? Like we know if you want to build on BLM land a wind farm, you know what the bond form looks like. It's that right-of-way bond form, and you know in advance how much it's going to cost because it's X thousands of dollars per turbine, depending on the size of the turbine. But you know that up front, it's easy for the agent to talk about with the client. The client can build that into all their models. But when we're dealing with and the other thing is these sites are getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
The last time we talked, I was dealing with most of my projects were like 5 megawatts to 20 megawatts, not super huge.
Yeah.
Now we're dealing with like 100, 500 megawatts, a gigawatt plus.
Oh,
They're getting really, really, really big.
Yeah.
And so those decommissioning obligations are going from $100,000 or $1 million to 15 million or more.
Yeah.
Wow.
And if you have to put it on a really onerous bond form, it might be harder to get a lower rate, right?
So I'm curious. So let's use wind as an example. So the decommissioning schemes, can that vary? Meaning, is it per turbine or is it a blanket, for a group of turbines, or is it depends on the situation?
Like the cost of it is usually per turbine for wind, but the entire decommissioning bond is going to be for the whole farm for that project entity. It's just going to be calculated per turbine.
So it can be considerable, I imagine.
Yeah, it can be pretty significant. I think like one of the largest ones that I've done recently was $16 million, and it's going to run for 30 years, and that's like a huge cost over the life of the project, right? Having a predictable, upfront, knowing this is what the bond form is, and generally speaking what the rate's going to be because we know what the bond form is, we understand your credit, that would be really helpful. One factor of this, though, that is also coming more into play now than it was the last time we spoke is repowering. So,
what does repowering mean?
Yeah, repowering is when you have the site use permit and you have the interconnection and you you own and operate this place, and maybe you want to put more efficient panels or bigger turbines, or you want to have batteries or different batteries. So in some of those cases, you may even be able to appreciate new tax credits. Based on the Inflation Reduction Act changed the landscape of all of this last year, and we're just starting to see how that
plays out.
Yeah, because we're just now getting the guidance from the IRS on what those tax credits are, how they can be used, because they can be transferred now, and that really wasn't the case before.
Oh, okay.
But this repowering idea, so we say decommissioning bonds in solar, for example, are usually 30-year obligations. But we just say that because that's what the manufacturers tell us is generally the useful life of them.
Right.
They would still generate power, but maybe you're getting significantly diminished returns at that point. But now we're saying, maybe, after 5 or 10 years, rather than waiting for 30, why don't we, take these panels out, put new highly efficient panels in? We can sell those old ones to, maybe a different country or something, or they can be potentially recycled. Now, recycling is not a huge part of the industry right now, but that's just because it doesn't have to be.
Right.
Once that need exists, there's going to be a whole new market for recycling these things, too. So that's going to change a lot of these decommissioning obligations. I don't think I'm going to see. I've written a couple of hundred of these things at least, and I don't imagine I'm going to see very many of them decommissioned in my career. Right.
Interesting. You had mentioned earlier BLM. Mm-hmm. So is there, if you're putting these on public property, are there certain kinds of bonds that are associated with that? Like, for example, is there a lease bond or anything of that nature that may occur?
Yeah, and then there can be all the different like easement bonds as well, especially because the wind farms tend to have much larger footprint than solar farms do, and even those have a tremendously large footprint. I'm working on one right now that the entire project is the size of Manhattan.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's big.
Yeah, that's big.
It's very big. But wind farms are even bigger. And then if they have associated transmission lines with them too, that can obviously be hundreds of miles or more.
Yeah.
And all the other bonds that you would think would be associated with, renting land and then developing land. But the easements can be a really big thing, and like the wildlife mitigation and endangered species and all those sorts of things. Those can add up a lot too on the bonding side. Yeah. Wow.
So, I mean, it seems like there's a lot of opportunities to write, bonds on these kinds of projects.
Mm-hmm. And I would say, if people are interested in this, like, alternative energy, renewable energy, like I said, solar, wind, battery storage, that's getting to be a pretty mature market.
Yeah.
But what's not is carbon capture and sequestration.
Okay.
What's not would be geothermal. They're hydrogen. There's a lot of these kind of emerging technologies that aren't really to scale yet, but they need the same kinds of bonds. Whether they be, these power purchase agreements, or they could just be more like supply bonds. I built an electrolyzer to, make hydrogen, and I'm selling it to an agricultural plant. They need a supply bond to deliver that, finished product. Like there are a lot of opportunities where there aren't a lot of like surety professionals out there on the cutting edge. And those, like, if I was to start right now, I wouldn't say do a bunch of solar bonds. If this is your world, I'd say figure out hydrogen, go to the hydrogen, those like conferences and stuff.
Space,
like that's where like there's going to be a lot of growth, but nobody knows anything about it.
Well, because you mentioned even with solar and wind, you had to like learn the industry before you could really get into bonding it. So I would imagine the same would be true of these newer industries.
And as an agent, when you're able to walk into a prospect's office and speak their language and use their terminology and talk about, for me, like price per watt or something, or if you're in the oil and gas, what's the price of oil per barrel right now? Like when you know those things, all of a sudden it gives you a bunch of credibility right out of the gate.
Yeah.
Whereas if I tried to go and work on an oil account right now, I would never. I have no idea. Like I don't use their words.
Yeah.
Right. So like that's the thing is I'm trying to see how can I get into like geothermal power and understand their because they drill wells. And they inject things and they have plugging and abandonment, but it's a whole other kind than it is on the oil and gas side.
With geothermal and other things like that, are you still do you think you need to educate the companies you're working with as well about bonding, or do you think there's more knowledge about bonding in those spaces?
I still need to educate them, especially because a lot of these groups are technology groups, and then they know banking, like they may have someone they got for their treasury or something, or they know investing. They think in terms of letters of credit. That's what they're thinking of. They don't see bonds every day. They didn't grow up. They're not construction people who know what a bond is. So getting them to understand the advantages of using bonds, it is happening all over again. Yeah.
That's what I was wondering. Yeah.
So I wanted to go back, when you were kind of laying out the continuum, one area you were saying about maintenance and operations. Mm-hmm. So maybe tell a little bit more about that.
So going back, so interconnection, power purchase agreements, decommissioning could be something you need pre-construction. Then we have the construction, and there are construction bonds associated with the construction, right? And they can be done a number of different ways. And oftentimes for these renewable energy groups, they may even flip over to the commercial side of things, depending on exactly what's being done in the structure. But then all the subcontractors, too. Most of the major contractors in the space are starting to require their subs to bond because the projects are getting so big. Right. And now we're seeing more and more of that work being done by big name contractors that we all know. These huge electrical contractors, national groups, because the work is actually pretty easy and desirable. It's pretty repetitive. It's not very risky. $100 million solar project is a lot easier to build than a $100 million building downtown. Right. So contractors love this work, and it's become very repeatable. So we're seeing more and more of like the traditional contractors kind of taking over this, but they're requiring their subs to bond, especially the electrical subs. That's a big part of it, and the site prep. But so the construction exists, and then after construction, what kind of bonding? So the PPA is something that would exist after bonding. You're guaranteeing the production of power. The decommissioning bond may not be needed until after that. Now, on the O&M side, I've seen almost no bonds required for the operation of any of these things. It's just not something that anybody has their flag
Head
up
wrapped
for.
around yet.
Like nobody is requiring it. They don't. It is pretty easy O&M on a solar site. It's like, I mean, you have to wash them off. Like most of the stuff is pretty automated at this point. There are drones that fly overhead and do like heat maps to see which panels are working and which aren't.
Yeah, that is interesting.
And there's a lot of maintenance and stuff that needs to happen on wind farms. But the bonding is just not there for those like contractual obligations. It's just they don't need the security.
But that surprises me. But
I'm surprised I haven't seen. I saw one once, and it was a slam dunk, and it was nothing. So I didn't get like really into the weeds on it.
Right.
But I think that might be a place where that could be an opportunity if we start to go toward like the independent power producers.
And
And a lot of times the independent power producers are also operating them themselves, so they're doing their own O&M. So they wouldn't be bonding if they're doing it for themselves.
Right.
So I wanted to go back. So you said, like, right now there are states wrestling with the right way to do it. So how do you get involved in having that discussion? Because it seems like it's going to be very important for the surety industry to be able to get known to those groups and have the opportunity to educate, maybe standardize where it makes sense, and how do we surface those opportunities?
Yeah, so they've come at me a few different ways. One way was just that I had worked with a client who was, working with a state, as an interested party, and they were talking about bonds. They said, "Nathan, you need to come here and tell these people what bonds are." One time it came from NASBP. Larry Leclerc, just contacted me because he knew that this is a space that I work in, and he's just like, "Let's have this conversation. Let's, what do you know about this space that we can offer up to help?" And then through my professional network, I've had people who, my colleagues at CAC Specialty, who they're getting involved in their local, statewide organizations. So they know that they're coming up with these rules, and they say, "Nathan, they're talking about decommissioning. Nathan, you know this stuff. Get on this call. I need you today."
Are there opportunities with some of those organizations representing these areas to dialogue and say, "Hey, wouldn't it be beneficial for your members if we could come up with uniform bonds, forms, or standard or best practices to help facilitate, the development and production of this energy?"
I do think that would be really helpful, yeah. And some of these groups are pretty obvious. Like in New York State, I don't remember the name of the group that manages it, but they send out, they publish these vague guidelines of how solar farms should be built in the state, and there's a small little paragraph that says, "And you should also require decommissioning security." But that's essentially all that it says.
We're a sub-note.
But it'd be very clear, if I had the bandwidth and the wherewithal to just contact that group directly and be like, "Hey, there's definitely room for advocacy for surety in this space." Yeah,
we'd like to be those footnotes, right?
Yeah.
So,
Well, I feel like we've learned a lot about alternative energy bonding. The update has been terrific. I want to get you back on to talk to us about hydrogen, carbon sequestration, and geothermal when you know more about it.
and when the markets mature a little bit too, right? The carbon capture and sequestration is definitely an area that is still kind of forming, right, with the rules around it and how bonds can be used and supplemented with insurance. And so there are a lot of things in all these spaces that are still being figured out for the first time.
It's going to be just change, I'm sure, while it all gets worked out.
I'm sure there'll be true hot topics for the future.
That's right.
Have me on again in 5 more years, and I'll tell you about it.
Thanks, Nathan.
You've been listening to Let's Get Surety, brought to you by the National Association of Surety Bond Producers. For more information about the NASBP and its members, Visit NASBP.org.
Before we go, we just want to say thank you again to Old Republic Surety for their generous support in sponsoring this episode of Let's Get Surety. For more information on Old Republic Surety, visit www.orsurety.com.